you name anybody, and of course the common man, are all concerned about the impact of climate change on this only planet we have. However, I think it's no more about the climate change, but the crisis of huge proportion called climate crisis. It has taken world leaders 26 years from COP1 to COP26 to debate the crisis, frame rules, regulations, financing, and targets to tackle the crisis. Unfortunately, actions have been muted compared to those agreed on papers. Not sure if we are late in resolving and tackling the issue related to climate change, which has resulted into this climate crisis. The world in the last 5 years has seen unprecedented disasters, from hurricanes to floods, to earthquakes, to tsunamis, to droughts, to extreme weather conditions. Most of this has impacted the mankind. And irony is that human activity is actually responsible for many of these very disasters. No denying the fact that poor and developing countries need more support and time to tackle climate crisis. But unproductive debates amongst governments, who emits more or less on per capita emissions versus absolute emission, is nothing but a loss-loss debate where only loser is humankind. Global average temperatures have been rising and already risen over degrees in last 100 years, largely driven by increased carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere and other human activities. If the temperature control is not controlled, temperature rise is not controlled, we may see some countries may cease to exist on this planet. Most warming occurred in last 40 years, and last 7 have been the warmest. These countries with high population and also high population density will be most impacted than the others. And India happens to be one of them. And this crisis gets only deeper with growing population. We all have to find ways and means to control temperature rise, through the control of carbon emissions. The tag word net zero needs to be carefully defined. Otherwise, this should not give a license to emit more and offset more. We have only one planet, and that much can be extracted out of this earth. So we must move to low consumption, reuse, and create a circular economy. No doubt government think tanks have a challenge to fight a conundrum of lives versus livelihoods as we move to a low carbon economy for fight against climate change. Unfortunately, we do not have a magic wand, nor the luxury of time. Therefore, the need to act is now. Act today. There is no denying that world has woken up and governments are now pushing hard to meet net zero targets, reducing carbon emissions to cap the temperature rise. But is this enough and a case too late? Only time will tell us as we discuss the whole issue with some of the people who were involved in shaping the fight against climate change. Indo-US cooperation in a big way on this issue through collaboration on financing and technology will help both the countries in tackling this climate on an immediate basis. I would now request our speakers of the day, Shri Vatsan Iyer. Is renewable the answer to fight the climate change goals? Do you see hydrogen as a new technology which will be like a holy grail to replace the existing energy to a totally green energy? Over to you, Shri Iyer. You're on mute.
Introduction. Sorry about that. Thanks again, Sunil. Thanks again for inviting me to participate in this conference. By means of introduction, my name is Shri Iyer. I'm the CEO of Hero Future Energies, which is a renewable independent power company, power producer based out of New Delhi in India. Sunil, you made some very apt comments in your introduction, and I think perhaps I want to start off with that, which is if you were to look at climate change and transition over into greenhouse gas emissions, about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions typically comes from the consumption of one form of energy or the other. The other 20%, and I'm going to give you fairly, I'd say, ballpark numbers here. The other 20% are mostly methane, NOxes and other gases, primarily coming from agriculture, land use, forestry, and so on. There's not a whole lot as an energy industry we can do to control this, because a lot of this comes from crop burning, forest burning, from landfills, from wastewater treatment, etc. Other than to make sure that there's a policy framework in place, and as an energy industry, we can do our bit to talk to the policy makers to make sure that that is controlled. But that being said, going back to the 80%, 80% is where the energy industry can pitch in and say, look, what can be done to decarbonize that 80% of the energy system to make sure that there's basically no greenhouse gas emissions that come from there. But again, slicing the 80% again into its component parts. As electricity, it's about 20% of the total emission, or of the total, I'd say, global energy consumption. Electricity production is about 20%. Transportation is about a third, about 35% or so. Industrial, which includes commercial, is about 25%. And there's others, which includes residential. And then what I also want to include here is consumption of hydrocarbons, for example, in areas such as petrochemicals and so on, constitutes about 20%. So if you were to look at the world of energy, and as energy companies, we can have a fairly significant impact on looking at how to transition about 80% of this away from hydrocarbon or away from greenhouse gas emitting type sources. So if you were to take a look at the energy transition, which is now, again, a fairly, I'd say, commonly used phrase or word, there's two parts of this energy transition. One is we produce electricity today, and a bulk of the electricity globally does come from greenhouse gas emitting sources, whether it's coal or natural gas or fuel oil or what have you. So part one of the energy transition is to say, let's try to decarbonize electricity production today, as well as electricity demand in a secular growth going forward. And that's where renewable energy has a fairly important role to play. In fact, I'd say a critical role to play. But that still constitutes only about 20% of energy consumption and use, or therefore 20% of potential greenhouse gas emission. The other critical part is, how do you take the other about 60% or so and move that to electricity? And that's where today other fuel sources, whether it's natural gas or crude oil or whatever, are being used in different forms. For example, it's liquid fuel for transportation, it's natural gas for heating and for industrial heating and residential heating and so on. And so part of the energy transition has to be, how do you electrify those processes? And I think that's a critical part of the role that renewable energy can play. The good news here is there's a recent study from Stanford that perhaps most of you have come across that basically says using conventional, commercially available technology today. So what they mean by that is the technical feasibility has been demonstrated, economic feasibility has been demonstrated because it's commercially relevant and viable. The world can decarbonize its energy matrix by 2035. That's a very aggressive goal, very aggressive timeline, but it's possible. Now, we obviously have to go back and say, what's the level of investment that's required? What's the level of investment in different types of infrastructures? What's the public-private partnership structure going to look like to make it happen? But the good news is we're not waiting for a yet to be developed technology. We're not looking for a holy grail of, look, this can only happen if A, B, and C happen. So this actually involves things like battery storage technology, which exists today. And in their theoretical model, they've said, look, you don't need battery storage to be in a brand new generation. It's only about 4 to 6 hours of battery storage, which conventional technology already gives you, that can make this decarbonization happen. And they were also talking about switching of the industrial uses to heat pumps, electric vehicles instead of fuel, internal combustion engine based vehicles, electricity for industrial heat. And a lot of these technologies already exist, right? EVs used to be a bit of a curiosity about a decade back. Today, it's almost the norm in most regions of the world. Clearly, growth rates are picking up, but it's not an evolving technology at this point. And interestingly, there's been a lot of debate also in terms of land availability. Is enough land in this world to accommodate renewable energy? Interestingly, their estimates, which I think have been borne out by others as well, is all of this can be done by using less than 0.5% of the total land mass available on Earth today. So we're not talking about a huge amount of extra resources that need to be put into play to make this happen. And interestingly, there's a similar study by NREL as well, the National Renewable Energy Labs in the US, giving a roadmap for the US to go 100% renewable energy for electricity. And they also look at a time frame of 2030 to 2035. Clearly, this roadmap shows it can be done. And roadmap also lays out what needs to happen in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investments, and so on to make it happen. And really, Sunil, I think one good thing could be if India develops that kind of roadmap for itself as well, to say, if we want to get there by 2030 or 2035, what's that roadmap going to look like? What are the investments? What's the infrastructure that needs to be put in place? So going back to your second part, I think we're talking about electricity conversion from coal, natural gas, crude to renewable energy already happening today, already growing rapidly. In terms of the other areas of energy, I think green hydrogen could start to play a fairly critical role. I think that's already happening, clearly not at scale, but there's announcements in every part of the world. The interesting thing about green hydrogen is it is a bridge between renewable and electricity and all the other industrial and heating uses that we talked about, because you use renewable electricity to produce green hydrogen, which can thereafter be burnt as a fuel for heating, or actually be even used in internal combustion engines or in fuel cell in heavy duty mobility, for example. And that's the next area that I think we need to look at in terms of the technology development in order to make it viable, both technically as well as commercially. It is indeed happening all over the world, so I'm fairly hopeful it will continue. A couple of points to wrap up here, Sunil. One is the Inflation Reduction Act recently passed in the US is actually very promising in terms of giving the right amount of policy support and financial support to the industry. The interesting part of this, apart from its support of renewable energy and electricity, is the support it gives for green hydrogen in the US. In fact, based on the tax credits announced, green hydrogen in the US could be on par with gray hydrogen in terms of commercial viability. In fact, interestingly, the US could be one of the lowest cost producers of green ammonia. If you look at green ammonia as a carrier of green hydrogen, it could be one of the lowest cost producers of green ammonia to deliver to a place like Asia, for example. So this is one way of exporting energy in the form of green hydrogen. It'd be really interesting. Now, I know the Indian government and the Power Minister, Mr. R.K. Singh, have announced a similar policy framework to come out in the next 2 to 3 months. It'll be interesting to see if that can happen, because India has a very similar renewable energy resource as the US. And if India follows a similar path as what's been done in the Inflation Reduction Act, I think we see a viable pathway for India to be a player in green hydrogen as well. One last parting thought before I wrap up and hand it back to you, Sunil, is we are talking about the energy transition. In fact, as you said, it's the phrase of the moment is climate change, it's greenhouse gas emission, it's energy transition. One topic that I've not seen quite addressed enough or addressed actively is the disruption that this is going to bring. What a lot of us do realize is the hundreds of billions of dollars in assets and investments that exist today in conventional energy systems, whether that be coal, whether that be oil, whether it be natural gas, exploration, production, distribution, and the tens or indeed perhaps hundreds of millions of direct and indirect jobs that are tied to these conventional energy sources. When we talk about switching or transitioning away from conventional energy to renewable energy, all of those investments and employment is at risk. The disruption is not going to come easy. It's not going to come without having an impact on people and livelihoods. I think one of the things that perhaps leave as food for thought for the policymakers is we're talking about adapting to climate change, we need to be talking about adapting to the energy transition and how to make sure that the people whose lives are impacted are given a pathway through this transition, whether it's in terms of retraining, whether it's in terms of safety nets or what have you. But that's a topic that I don't see discussed actively enough. And if not taken care of, I think could actually slow the energy transition and the greenhouse gas goals of all of the countries on the planet. With that, I turn it back to you, Sunil.
Thank you, Shri. You've given us some very thought-provoking ideas and questions to be answered. Friends, our chief guest of the session, Honorable Parliamentarian Mr. Suresh Prabhu, will have to leave slightly early. He's got some other commitments. So I would request Mr. Suresh Prabhu to address us. And before he does that, maybe I would like to speak a few words about him. I've known him for quite some time now. It probably dates back to 15 years. And he's probably one of the most renowned parliamentarians I have met across, who has handled probably 8 or 10 important cabinet portfolios over his political career. Mr. Suresh Prabhu is currently a founding chancellor of Rishi Hood University and the guest professor for London School of Economics. An accomplished chartered accountant, banker, educationist, social worker, and a politician. Probably we can't do justice to Mr. Suresh Prabhu's CV in such a short time. But one important portfolio and one important achievement which relates to my sector is he's the architect of the current Electricity Act, basis of which the entire fundamental of the country's electricity regulations and laws are depending upon. So he brought that first Act 2003, for which probably he should have been given much more. He deserves much more. Under the Prime Minister Modi, he was also the Sherpa to the G7 and G20, where he was shaping the official agenda for the Government of India on key issues, which included climate change. Over to Mr. Suresh Prabhu for his thought-provoking ideas and his guidance. What can be done more on this climate crisis, as I call it, not climate change anymore? Mr. Suresh Prabhu.
Thank you, my dear friend, the chair of the session, Mr. Sunil Jain, for articulating all the issues, as well as the previous speakers who have also spelled it out what needs to be done. The problem with climate change, everybody knows what is to be done, but the question is who is going to do it and where it are going to do it. And when is equally important, because if you do the same thing after some time, there's no need to do anything because nobody will be here on the planet. So therefore, the urgency of it is extremely important, as well as working on it in a holistic manner is even more important. As you can see now, the challenge is that climate change is already posing huge issues for the humanity. In fact, just now, as we speak, what is happening in Pakistan is probably a trailer of what could happen if we don't really work together in a way that is really necessary. So climate change is now giving us the shape of things to come in a shortest possible time. 1/3 of Pakistan is underwater. The lands which have been cultivated over a long period of time, they may not become cultivable for us sometime at least. And also the damage it has caused to property, to the lives, to the livestock is absolutely huge and colossal. And therefore, we must keep this in mind that what has happened to Pakistan is just like a glimpse of what really could happen to the whole world. And then this has happened just at a time when Europe is facing unprecedented heat waves. And it's also happening at a time when the waters in most of the important rivers of the world is no longer flowing. The rivers are becoming dry. So we have been able to discover now some of the remains of so many historical events like World War, etc. in those rivers. And therefore, I can just say that probably if we don't act now, then it's probably too late. So this is the first. Secondly, let me welcome, because it's the Indo-American Chamber program, I must welcome the initiative of President Biden in terms of the new initiative which he has taken, which is unprecedented. I would call it even historical to some extent, and also path-breaking in many ways. So this is a very important thing that America is taking leadership of the issue after some time when the earlier administrations have questioned whether the climate change really exists or not. So from there, we have come exactly the opposite way. The pendulum has swung, and now we are really taking a concrete action. So I must say something which is so important from the climate change perspective is we are all focused on economic growth, but economy itself will take such a beating as Pakistan is seeing now, that most of their good part of GDP will have to be devoted to rebuilding, for rescue, for restoration. And therefore, you cannot imagine what's the cause of it. Certainly climate change. In fact, I'm very happy that UN Secretary General, when he visited Pakistan to view it personally, he said this is a devastation which is caused by climate change. And therefore, this is the first evidence of what climate change could do. So I think it's a very important message for the whole world community to learn. And it's no longer true that we cannot say this is Pakistan, so we forget. The whole world will be engulfed by these challenges as Europe is facing today, America also facing some part of it, even Colorado River, which is now going dry, and this is a big issue to be faced, along with Yangtze River, along with other rivers in Europe. So I think this is a very big issue to be dealt with. Now, how do you deal with it? As I said, we know the solution. Energy transition luckily is happening. But when we do the transition, I think we should be a little careful about what we are getting into. No doubt, hydrogen is a good solution, particularly for the liquid fuel, for the mobility. But in a country like India, now we just welcome what is happening in US, and I really like it. In India, we have to convert water, and that to a fresh water, to make hydrogen. Now, as you know, we are only 4% of the fresh water of the world. Now we have to break the water into two parts, and therefore what we get out of it will be converted into hydrogen eventually. Now, can we have the luxury of converting fresh water, which will be diverted from other uses? What will be the implications of that? We need to see. Secondly, we know that there's the countries like in Latin America, which have plenty of water. 26% of the water of the world with only 6% of the population. So I think obviously right place, but to break that water and to make the hydrogen, you need energy again. So somebody might come and say, why not we use the saline water? So first, to convert saline water into fresh water, the potable or fresh water, non-saline water, we have to use energy. Again, we'll have to use energy to break it and to make it into hydrogen. So I think whether we'll have such luxury and whether we should do that, we should think very carefully, because energy transition should not lead to some challenges for agriculture, because agriculture cannot survive without water, and nobody can survive, no human being or no living being can survive without water. And the food that comes from agriculture also sustains the humanity. So I think we'll have to think very carefully when we are using energy transition, what adverse impact it will have on the other sector, that we should be very careful in doing that. Secondly, as we know, and Mr. Jain, you yourself have been doing that for a long period of time, is making distributed generation of electricity. Whether we should now go in, because hydrogen, as my previous speaker was saying, would need billions, probably trillions of dollars of investment to create infrastructure. And when you create such trillions of dollars of investment in infrastructure, now the question that is posed for us, what happens to the present investment which has gone into fossil fuel infrastructure? What happens to jobs, the millions of jobs that are being created in this infrastructure? Therefore, we should be careful. So same thing should not happen, that because now we make trillions of dollars of investment and new millions of jobs that we create in the hydrogen sector, whether we'll have another, once we discover probably over a period of time that we need another alternative, whether we can have the luxury of doing that first and repenting at leisure. So I think we should think about it very carefully. And in that context, I fully feel and really feel that we should go for a distributed generation. That will not require so much of investment. That will not require the portability of bringing any new source of energy from faraway place into this, because even to transport it from faraway place to here, we also need energy, right? So we need more energy for transportation. And therefore we need to create even more energy, because transportation is essential. So I think distributed generation can avoid these pitfalls in a very efficient as well as very effective way. So I think we should think about it very carefully. Another opportunity arising out of the challenge is how to deal with, and you just mentioned it about a circular economy. I think I must tell you that there are enough evidences available in India where the social sector have been processing waste in a way that helps agriculture. All this composting helps avoid, it's good for the soil security. It creates more jobs, more employment in rural areas. I just recently witnessed something which has been happening in Gujarat, in Chota Nagpur area, in Kutch. I was very impressed. And this is done by the social sector. Non-governmental organizations, so foundation, others are really doing wonderful work. So in that context, I am just saying, should we not work on solutions which are not necessarily designed on a centralized model like today? So we are making huge investment, just not energy, but say let's electricity. We are making investment for 2,000, 3,000 megawatts at one place. Even hydro, which is relatively good because it does not emit other greenhouse gases except methane if you store it. But if you really look at those investments, like 3 Gorges project, which is more than 18,000 megawatts at one single place. And that is now was generated because of Yangtze, which is one of the largest river flowing in the world. And now it has gone dry, so they are facing big problem. So suppose if you are distributed generation, maybe solar, maybe wind, maybe biomass, or based on this waste, which I just mentioned, and I've seen these examples in many places in India. It is replicable in any part of the world, particularly those who do not have energy, access to energy today, like Africa, and can solve the problem, create jobs that we talk about, and may not require the trillions of dollars investment. And also, that helps if the discovery of new technology in future will not involve such displacement cost that we are talking today of hundreds of billions of dollars which have gone into creating hydrocarbon related infrastructure. And therefore, we really need to think carefully and come out with solutions that are necessary, which will not create a situation wherein we get locked into a one kind of choice and prevents us from being little more flexible in terms of offering opportunities when they come in future from new development. So I think that's something which we must keep in mind. But I am concerned by the fact that while we were doing this, the geopolitics of the world is also challenging the climate change itself. Like after Ukraine war, some of the European countries are left with no choice but to go in for coal-fired power plants. And I think that again is a very challenging issue for us. So when we talk about energy transition, it is transition for future, going for a better direction, not going backwards and try to start producing something which we had abandoned for a good reason in the past. So I think this is something, again, we must keep in mind that geopolitics, which is creating problem. So can we think about a situation in which geopolitics will not derail something which threatens humanity as well as the entire biological life? As we have seen, biodiversity, good part of it is already lost, and the terrestrial biodiversity particularly. And now the marine biodiversity is under serious threat at a time when we probably now need to find out how we preserve something which we already have and try to build on that to make future generations' lives a little bit better than what it is today. And I can tell you again, when we are talking about it, when the IPCC under the UNFCCC umbrella were preparing reports and warning us that this might happen, and the science was warning us. This was not a politician's warning. If a politician were speaking the right language, but science were giving us the right direction. And we never heard them, heeded that advice. And today, look, let's see what's happening in all parts of the world, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in South Asia, whether it's in East Asia, Far East. All over the world, we have been affected by different dimensions, different effects of the same cause, which is causing it is climate change. So just imagine, no one is safe, as we see, which we have seen already in COVID, when it was said that no one is safe unless everybody is safe. So I think this is also true for climate change, that unless we really take collective action, act on it in a manner that will save every individual in the world, till he is saved, till all geographies are saved, no other geography is safe from the effects of climate change. So I think this is a message. Unfortunately, we have to accept the reality, work on it. But as always, I've seen that Indo-American Chamber always works to make topical issues. And it's a good platform to work along with our friends from United States. We have been having a dialogue on climate change tagged to with US for a long time. And Mr. John Pedostar is to lead it from the US side. And one of the finest person who understands climate change very well is very deeply committed to this. And many other friends from the US and from the Indian side, Mr. Samshed Godrej has also been leading this. So I think we really need to take some steps forward. First, to understand each other better, forge an alliance to make others also act on this, and to begin with, also have exchange of ideas, exchange of technologies, but not take a wrong path, which will make sure that today we address one problem, but eventually we should not feel that we have created more problems. So I hope we work in the right direction. I'm very happy that such distinguished people, which we have been able to put together, I think they will really make sure that we will take it forward in the right manner. I must congratulate all of you, and particularly my dear friend, Mr. Sunil Jain, who I know is totally committed to this cause. He has been one of the few industry leaders I've seen that who acts and does what he believes in, and does not get constrained by the fact that business interest will not help him, but his business instead aligns to that of the humanity, and that's why he's successful. So I really look forward to working with you. I think SR Capital is the company that you now represent. I hope we have enough capital, the human capital left. We have enough natural capital left in the world. We have enough intellectual capital available to us to act in the right manner as we go along. So thank you very much, Mr. Jain, and all my co-colleagues who are co-panelists who are participating in this program. I'm sure they will add more value than what I'm speaking as a politician, because I have always seen many times politicians, rather than adding value, they might be causing a depreciation. So as I'm a chartered accountant, I always think about two things: appreciation or depreciation. Appreciation happens in marketplace, depreciation happens when you don't use asset in the right manner. So I hope we use our intellectual capital as an asset and work in the right manner. More importantly, to add to intellectual capital, we must add wisdom that is far more missing in the world today. I hope that comes to the fore and we take the right action. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Prabhu. You know, as always, you have been to the point. You speak from the heart, and very difficult to match your intellectual capital, especially on climate change issues. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
May I now?
Anything that you would like to do in future?
Pardon, sir?
I am saying, please count on my support for anything that you like to do in future.
Definitely, Kashish, you must be, because his wisdom is a rare thing which India has. You know, we must utilize that.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Surely. Yes.
May I now request our guest of honor, Mr. Damon Dubord, he will speak on from the embassy side and from the American perspective, and how both of us countries can collaborate to move forward. Thank you, Mr. Damon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Sunil Jain, other distinguished panelists and virtual guests. It's a real honor to be here today for the 19th Indo-US Economic Summit, and honor to represent the US government. My name is Damon Dubord. I'm the Energy Unit Chief at the US Embassy here in New Delhi, and very excited to be speaking on this panel. As the earlier guests mentioned, this is one of the defining issues of our time. It's critical globally, and we must take collective action, as our last panelist said, if we're going to move forward. Today, I want to focus a little bit on India's successes in developing a robust clean energy strategy, as well as consider some of our shared climate goals. In 2022, we mark the 75th year of US-India partnership, which is significant. But now we are facing real challenges, including those caused by a climate crisis, as it's been called by you as well, Mr. Jain. This climate challenge poses an existential threat to our people, but it also presents opportunities for our governments and our businesses to create innovative jobs, to strengthen communities, to help advance environmental justice. And working together, I think we can make great headway on all of these goals. Addressing climate change is a core priority worldwide, and we must work together. It's imperative to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as set out in the Paris Agreement. We were pleased to see India advance its nationally determined contributions well ahead of COP27, and India's NDCs will further reduce emissions intensity and increase the percent of installed capacity from fossil fuel sources by 2030. And we look forward to working with the Indian government to make more additional bold initiatives so that we can get closer to this ultimate objective of getting to net zero. I'm very proud to report, and it was alluded to a little bit earlier, that the US is indeed making progress. Soon after his inauguration, President Biden took executive action to aggressively tackle climate change in the United States domestically, but also to partner with countries abroad. When we recommitted to the Paris Agreement, we also established new NDCs for ourselves, including eliminating carbon pollution from our power sector by 2035 and creating a net zero emissions economy no later than 2050. Of course, in August, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest US investment ever to combat climate change. The act addresses climate crisis and strengthens our energy security by creating manufacturing jobs in solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles. And the act authorizes billions of dollars in additional funding in federal loans and loan guarantees, which will support the private sector as they make investments in clean energy projects in the United States. But beyond this independent action of our governments, we have made great strides together on climate working together. And our cooperation stretches back more than 100 years, beginning with the US Bureau of Land Reclamation work at the Bakra Bees Dam in Himachal Pradesh in the 1920s. Now today, our cooperation on renewable energy has never been stronger. We're working closely to further the goals of the US Climate Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership to transition to a climate responsive and clean energy economy. Additionally, this partnership supports power efficiency, responsible oil and gas, renewable energy, sustainable growth, and emerging fuels and technologies. As one example of how we can achieve more by working together, the US Agency for International Development, our development organization within the US government, is partnering with the Indian government to help Indian railways achieve net zero carbon by 2030. And we're doing this by adopting large-scale renewable energy and energy efficiency strategies. But looking at our private sector colleagues that are participating virtually and also on this panel, I'd be remiss to not comment on the great business-to-business ties that we're seeing. And they've really never been stronger either. US partners are investing in, they're contributing technology to India's remarkable growth in solar and wind and other renewables. And I'll point out that in December of last year, the US Development Finance Corporation, which is our development bank, they orchestrated $500 million in debt financing in a package for First Solar's new solar component factory in Tamil Nadu. I think this really demonstrates our commitment to supporting a bilateral renewable strategy that enhances both our economies, but also our energy security. It also demonstrates the important role that the private sector must play in reaching our climate objectives. In closing, I just want to say that the climate crisis is a real global threat, and we acknowledge that the solutions must stretch across borders. President Biden has said that the root of our partnership is deep, the connection between our peoples, the ties of family, of friendship, of shared values. And these ties go very deeply in the government of India. And I think it's imperative that we look to new tools and new ways of cooperating as governments, but bringing in the private sector as well to enhance investments, to unlock capital as we build out these new technologies in areas, as you mentioned, such as green hydrogen and other renewables. And we think about this transition. And I was thinking, as I heard from the other panelists talking about some of the other unintended effects as we transition and we move away from old line industries in the fossil fuel sector, and how we must also think about ways that we can empower and work with the people that their jobs have been left behind and incorporate them in our new transition and in our new technologies as we build a cleaner economy. So with that, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel to speak on such an important issue, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues as we continue discussing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Devan. That was well articulated about how US and India can collaborate and what US has already started doing with the new government in place on the climate change. I'm sure going forward till 2030, our Indo-US collaborations on climate change and renewables will grow leaps and bounds to create a new framework of agreements. Thank you. Well, capital, as we have been all discussing, money is required for everything. I would like to bring in the new panelist, Vani Mehta. And Vani, for last many years, the developed world and the developing world have crossed swords on funding the climate change and who funds whom. What and how can we do a win-win situation and how a framework can be built to finance this energy transition? There's a huge amount of capital available in the market, but how it needs to be channeled in the right way, and what are the instruments and markets through which this financing can be raised? Maybe you can throw some light on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be at the 19th Indo-US Economic Summit organized by the Chambers of Indo-American Chambers of Commerce. And it's been absolutely amazing listening to the distinguished panelists share their thoughts on climate change. It's so rightly said that this is the only world that we live in. We have to wake up and save this world, otherwise there'll be nothing to save. And taking that entire thought process across different markets, be it fossil fuel, be it hydrogen, be it alternate fuels, and looking at different other sources, one thing which also every business is thinking about is how do you generate more economic ways of providing better, cleaner fuel in different markets and across different regulatory regimes. And there's been a lot of talk about it. There's been the regulators who've been looking at it, thinking about it. And one of the things, they've come up with a concept that we call today the green finance. It is something that has taken the world, I would say, the markets with a lot of interest, with a lot of excitement across the globe. And what is this global green bond market? And it is a new word as far as green finance is concerned. And today we are looking, in 2022, the world is expected to sort of reach a point wherein this market is going to be so huge. Like today, we are talking about a US $1 trillion market. The energy sector is the largest recipient of these green bonds. And India is nowhere far behind than the rest of the world when it comes to, delving deep into green bonds. So, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what are green bonds and what is it, bringing on for the investor, for the world. We know that this is an instrument which is helping push everyone through I would say safer uses of energy, looking at renewable energy, low carbon. But what is it? So basically, green bonds are debt instruments that are used by any company to raise funds for investors. And this will not be very different from any other bond that is out there in market. But the basic difference is that it is being called earmarked for only towards financing green projects. Now, green projects is something that the companies commit themselves as part of the management strategy, investing money, assets, creating or doing business activities with an environmental benefit. It could be anything ranging from renewable energy, be it in the hydro field, be it low carbon transportation, etc. And this trend of issuance of green bonds is not a very new trend across the globe. It started more than a decade back, I would say around 2007, when organizations like the European Investment Bank and the World Bank, along with other governments, came up with the concept of issuance of green bonds. And the benefits are huge. It just, firstly, the fact that, the company's commitment to dedicating certain funds for green projects, for financing these green projects, and also it creates a viable vehicle for increasing pool pool of sustainable investors to access environmental projects. Today, we are seeing a rise in a group of investors who want to invest in companies not just for economic benefit, but also because this is our planet. We all feel a sense of duty towards our planet to how can we help. An individual might, at their own personal level, they can do a lot to help the environment, but at an economic level, yes, they can. And this green bonds is one of those viable vehicles which are provided by the corporate world to the investors out there. So in 2015, India came up, one of the private banks came up with the first green bond in India. And this was almost 1,000 crore project with a 10-year issuance. And recognizing the fact that this is the way to be, and this is where the economy is going to grow, the Securities Exchange Board, SEBI, issued a concept note on green bond in 2015, and thereafter it followed up with a detailed circular in 2017, wherein it spoke about mandatory disclosures for issuance and listing of green debt securities. And it was formally, there's been in 2021, there's been guidelines regarding it. And the reason why there's been so much talk about it, there's been numerous changes which the government has and SEBI has looked into it, is because they feel that this is a growing area. It needs a sense of direction. There has to be some sort of a regulation. And one of the things that SEBI has now done in the latest guidelines is that they have made sure that you would issue a statement on your environmental objects. You would provide more details on the decision-making process, and also it has to show up that how are you identifying projects and how are the proceeds going to be from the green bonds. They're going to be used for these projects. So a lot of detailed disclosures by the companies need to be made. As far as regulation and management of these green projects is concerned, and also it gives the investor an option that if case they would want to have an independent third-party reviewing to maintain the independence and autonomy and the entire concept of a new investor that we're looking at today who wants to invest in such sort of securities. So that has been addressed by SEBI. And what has happened, if you see, it's not just green bonds. Across in the last, I would say, 6 to 7 years, the market regulators have looked at it very carefully. We've got the ESR regulation, we've got the guidelines, we've got that constantly evolving, the guidelines which have been talking about disclosures by the companies as part of the corporate CSR projects on environment. All this is very, if we look at it, there's a common thread to it to make sure that today, yes, everyone feels very passionate about environment, everyone is very passionate about climate change, but how do you sort of come up with a structure, a framework where things are channelized in the correct way by corporate, and there's also an encouragement. And there's a well-defined way of management of funds. And I feel this is the right approach to make as far as the growth of the sector is concerned. And also that it will, today what we have, it is in bits and pieces happening. But over the years, in the next 5 years, 6 years, we are looking at creating a framework. We are looking at creating a tax regime, where environmental, sustainable priorities of a company will be just like any other business-driven priorities. So it has to be regulated. We need to address the fact that there should not be greenwashing like what we've seen in the past, and the green investors, are able to judge projects in, and also help grow and encourage this entire drive that the governments, the investors, the company, the corporate world is taking forward to make sure that we are doing our bit for the environment. And also, one thing I wanted to mention, that because we've seen so much of growth in the sovereign bonds, green bonds area, the union budget this year, 22-23, they issued an announcement of a new framework for sovereign green bonds. I think it is a very encouraging initiative by the government. that, and it will help in creation of a green bond benchmark for India, both offshore and onshore financing. The government needs to set targets for green financing from its fiscal sources, especially for areas such as smart grids and other green utilities. And I think it's a great step. We highly applaud, and we look forward to seeing these green bonds in the market. And this initiative by the government is a huge boost to the entire concept of green investment, and also it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Ani. That was very well said about how we can do the financing. My only question is that green bonds should not be just a label of green, but they should come with some incentives for the investors, and therefore which will drive the money into them. Today, people are not differentiating between a normal bond and a green bond, except that it is invested into a green project. Thank you so much, Vani. That was very helpful. Last but not the least, we have Manish Dembla as a partner with the Kocher and Company. Manish, there's so much of discussions on climate change and green projects that continents and countries are trying to bring regulations for cross-border trade, non-tariff barriers like a cross-border carbon tax. Europe in particular. How do you see as a legal person that a regulatory framework, will it be sustainable, and hope that it is not so disruptive, that it forces people to not adopt the green technologies because it is becoming prohibitive to sell their products? How do you see this thing moving forward, and what is the timeline you see in future when this could become a reality?
Thank you, Mr. Jain, and good afternoon to the esteemed co-panelists and all those who are watching the live stream. It's an absolute honor and privilege to address such an august gathering. As Mr. Jain already introduced me, I'm a lawyer and I'm a partner with the leading Indian law firm Kocher & Co. As Mr. Jain said, cross-border carbon taxes are an imminent reality. The European Commission has already proposed a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, in 2021, which will introduce a carbon tax on certain carbon intensive products imported into the European Union. And as per the current status, some reporting obligations are slated to kick in from January 2023, while there will be a transition period of 24 months before the CBAM applies in full. In the United States, the Democrats had first proposed a similar mechanism through the Fair Transition and Competition Act in July 2021, which has been followed up with the Clean Competition Act in June 2022. Both the said bills are currently pending. Today, I want to talk about why such mechanisms are being proposed, the concerns which have been raised by developing countries like India, how could such concerns be addressed, some lingering questions which might make the CBAMs contentious, and finally, I'll try to summarize it all in a few sentences. First, why cross-border carbon taxes? As of today, there are about 35 countries which are pricing emissions through domestic carbon taxes. However, the average carbon price is $6 per ton, while the World Bank estimates that a carbon price of $100 per ton would be required to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives. Now, due to the lower carbon prices, the domestic industry in such countries has been able to withstand competition from imported products which are not subject to carbon taxes. However, if the leading economies were to raise the domestic carbon prices to meet the emission reduction targets, it would lead to two undesirable consequences. One, reducing the competitiveness of domestic products, and second, carbon leakage. Now, what is carbon leakage? If carbon prices increase in a country, the carbon intensive industries could relocate to another country with a lower carbon price. Now, this would not only cost jobs and tax money to countries with a higher carbon price, but could also increase carbon emissions elsewhere, which will offset any emission reduction in countries with a higher carbon price. Now, the best and a utopian solution would be to achieve a uniform carbon price, which in turn would require a global agreement. Now, such a global agreement is something which would be the least disruptive. However, it seems unlikely that we're going to be able to achieve such an agreement anytime in the next decade. So therefore, as domestic carbon prices increase to meet the emission reduction targets, a number of countries are expected to explore a cross-border carbon tax like the EU or the US. And a simple mechanism for carbon taxes could work like this. Suppose a country A applies a domestic carbon tax, say at the rate of $30 per ton of CO2 emitted. It would then levy an equivalent tax under the CBAM on goods imported from countries that do not have a domestic carbon pricing regime. So, which would mean that all goods consumed in country A would be subject to the same carbon related costs, which will ensure a level playing field for domestic producers while eliminating the risk of carbon leakage. Now, what are the concerns of developing countries with such mechanisms? Developing countries like India have opposed the EU CBAM on two grounds. One, they have questioned its compatibility with the WTO. And second, they have alleged that it is discriminatory and goes against the Paris Agreement principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, as far as compatibility with the WTO is concerned, the then Deputy Director General of the WTO, Mr. Jean-Marie Pogum, had made a statement in September 2021, clarifying the WTO stand. And he basically stated that cross-border carbon taxes are compatible with the WTO so long as they're not discriminatory or protectionist. But this statement still begs the question that wouldn't a CBAM unfairly penalize exports of developing countries? Now, there's no doubt that every country should accept responsibility for tackling climate change, which is a shared global threat. But developed countries who have historically contributed a larger share of cumulative carbon emissions cannot expect the developing countries to shoulder the same burden. So, what could be a fair solution to this legitimate concern of the developing countries? I would suggest that goods imported from 46 least developed countries as defined by the UN could be exempted from a CBAM levy. Lower middle income countries such as India could be exempted up to a predetermined threshold. And in order to guard against carbon leakage, it could be provided that the CBAM levy would be triggered in the event of a surge in imports from such countries. At the same time, to ensure that developing economies are not discouraged from reducing carbon emissions, these exemptions could be temporary and linked to levels of development so that they are phased out after a certain period. Such exemptions would also be consistent with EU's current everything but arms scheme and the generalized system of preferences scheme. Now, what are the other issues which could make the CBAMs contentious? I would say that the devil, as always, would lie in the details of such CBAMs. For instance, how do you calculate the carbon content or carbon footprint of the imports concerned in a fair and transparent manner? Are you going to rely on the data provided by the manufacturer, which may not be reliable? Or are you going to adopt some kind of benchmark, which again would always be disputed? Second, how do you objectively take into account the policies adopted and efforts made to mitigate climate change by countries from which the imports originate? The positive aspect of EU CBAM is the 24 months transition period. It would allow time for dialogue and for resolving any issues. And I hope there is more cooperation, more dialogue, and less friction, lesser conflict, so that we could arrive at a carbon pricing regime which is both fair and transparent and addresses the concerns of the developing countries. If I have to summarize, I would say that yes, cross-border carbon taxes are imminent. They may face challenges before the WTO on grounds of being discriminatory, protectionist, and being against the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And they should provide some temporary exemptions for developing countries. Thank you. Over to Mr. Jain.
Great, Manish. That was a great narrative of what should be done, and you have also given a solution to the issues which will come up. I must thank all the panelists and our guest of honor, Mr. Damon, and also thank in absentia our chief guest.
We are waiting for you.
So good evening, everyone. I am Upasana Arora.
You are, you are in the healthcare, no?
Neelu, will you please mute your mic, Neelu? So good evening, everybody.